never slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. Everything I do so instinctive and so passionate. Every word I move so descriptive like an adjective. I got a vendetta against people who patented being negative when you should be getting after it. I got facts.
Particular kind of joy I feel when the lights dim, the chatter in the theater fades, and the screen begins to glow with the first flickers of a new cinematic adventure. That joy becomes something else, something richer, when the film in question is The Bad Guys 2, 2025. And before we go any further, let me warmly welcome you, my friends, my fellow lovers of narrative craft and literary nuance. If you've been here before, you already know this isn't just about liking or not liking a movie. This is about unpacking it, unwrapping like a beloved, dog-eared novel whose pages have been turned by generations of curious hands. If you're new here, welcome to Cinema Vault, a little corner of the internet where we treat film the way some treat poetry, something to be read, reread, and understood in layers. If you enjoy thoughtful dissections like this, I'd be grateful if you gave the video a like and subscribed. It's how our community grows, one conversation at a time. And I should make something clear from the outset. This isn't a review in the conventional sense. I'm not here to tell you whether you should see this movie on opening weekend or wait for streaming. No, this is a deeply intellectual, theoretical exploration, a critical analysis through the eyes of someone who believes film is part of a much larger tapestry of storytelling, woven into literature, philosophy, cultural history, and human emotion. We'll go beyond surface impressions, peering into themes, subtext, and the invisible architecture that holds a narrative together. I'll admit, this film touched something personal in me. Not because the characters mirror my own life, but because they illuminate a dynamic I've always been fascinated by. The perpetual tug-of-war between the stories people tell about themselves and the stories others tell about them. This has been a preoccupation of mine since I was a child, hearing relatives recall the same family events in wildly different ways. Who are we, really? Are we the sum of our actions, or the sum of other people's perceptions of our actions? This movie toys with those questions, often in playful, even absurd ways, but the emotional core is surprisingly sturdy. When the opening scene unfurls, it does so with a sly wink to the audience. The filmmakers clearly understand that this isn't just a continuation of a story. It's the deepening of a relationship. The characters return to us like old friends who've been away for a year, and now they've come back with stories to tell. There's a comfort in that, a recognition of rhythms we know, but there's also an undercurrent of change. Something's different this time, and you can feel it from the first few moments. The pacing is just a little quicker, the dialogue sharper, the energy more electric. It's as if the movie is telling you, you think you know these people, but watch closely. The plot begins with a hook that's both thrilling and thematically rich. It wastes no time in plunging us into a world of layered moral ambiguities. You think you're watching a heist unfold, and you are, but every action is doubled with an unseen consequence. Every witty quip masks an unspoken tension. The narrative dances between lighthearted chaos and genuine stakes, inviting the audience to laugh while also pulling them toward the edge of their seat. I couldn't help but be reminded of the great caper stories of classic literature, those in which wit and danger are two sides of the same coin, spinning in the air before coming down in a way you can't quite predict. There's a sequence early on that instantly drew me in. It's clever, yes, but what truly made it sing was a layering of intention behind it. On the surface, it's a bold, fast-paced maneuver by the crew to outsmart a rival. Underneath, though, it's a chess game about trust, loyalty, and the slow erosion of both. The brilliance lies in how the film refuses to telegraph its deeper moves. You're laughing, marveling at the antics, and then, without warning, A line of dialogue cuts through the humor and lands with unexpected weight. It's this weaving of tones, comedy and quiet introspection, that makes the film linger in your mind long after credits roll. As the story progresses, we begin to see cracks in the facade of camaraderie. It's never heavy-handed. The filmmakers know better than to shout their themes at us. Instead, there are small betrayals, glances that last a fraction too long, jokes that mask an uncomfortable truth. For me, these moments echoed something very real. The way friendships and partnerships evolve over time, not always for the better. We all like to think we know our people, but time has a way of shifting allegiances, of revealing ambitions we didn't see before. I found myself thinking about how this all ties into the classic literary archetype of the noble rogue, the character who walks the line between hero and villain, whose choices are as much about self-definition as they are about survival. Each member of the ensemble fits into this mold in their own way, but here's the twist. The film plays with our expectations by forcing these rogues into situations where the right choice is murky at best. That moral slipperiness gives a narrative its bite. Now, without giving too much away, there's a mid-story event that acts like a hinge on which the whole plot swings. It reframes what you've seen so far and makes you question everything you thought you knew about the alliances at play. It's not a cheap twist. It's seeded carefully, almost invisibly, from the very beginning. I have a deep respect for this kind of narrative craftsmanship. As in great literature, the best plot turns are those that feel both surprising and inevitable. The visuals deserve their own mention. The animation style here is not just technically impressive, but thematically coherent. Every line, every color choice feels deliberate. The cityscapes are painted with a vibrancy that mirrors a character's oversized personalities. But look closely, and you'll see shadows creeping in, literal and figurative, that foreshadow the complications ahead. The cinematography is equally meticulous, playing with angles and framing to subtly control how we perceive the power dynamics between characters. It reminded me of how in certain novels, the choice of point of view shapes not just what we know, but how we feel about knowing it. And the sound design, the sound design, is the unspoken character in the room. The musical cues flirt with the boundaries between playful mischief and tense anticipation. There's a recurring motif in the score, a tiny fragment of melody, that evolves over the course of the film, much like the characters themselves. I couldn't help but think of it as a leitmotif from a 19th century opera repurposed for a modern animated caper. By the time the narrative moves into its later acts, the stakes have risen in ways both external and internal. Yes, there's a tangible, plot-driven danger, but there's also the more subtle thread of the group unraveling from within. The film makes it clear that trust, once fractured, is far harder to mend than a broken plan. And it's here that the emotional core really comes into focus. Underneath the high-speed chases, the clever ruses, and the snappy banter, there's a story about identity, belonging, and the longing for redemption. One of the film's most intriguing strengths is its ability to keep us rooting for characters who are, by all accounts, operating outside the law. It's a testament to the script's understanding of human complexity. We aren't just drawn to them because they're charismatic or skilled. We're drawn to them because they reflect parts of ourselves we don't often talk about. The messy, contradictory parts. The parts that crave connection but fear vulnerability. The parts that are willing to bend the rules to protect something or someone that matters. In the final stretch, as threads converge and secrets come to light, the pacing tightens like a drum. Every choice matters now, and every small deception earlier in the film pays off in ways that feel both satisfying and, in some cases, bittersweet. There's a final image that lingers, a quiet moment amid the chaos, that feels like the truest expression of the film's soul. It's not loud, it's not flashy, but it's honest. Stepping out of the theater afterward, I found myself walking slower than usual. My mind was still inside the story, still turning over its questions like stones in a pocket. That's the mark of a work worth revisiting. Not because it's perfect, few things are, but because it understands the power of narrative to entertain, to provoke, and to hold a mirror up to who we are. And in a world where so much cinema is content to skim the surface, that's a quality worth celebrating. The very first image that greets us isn't grand or ostentatious. It's sly. There's a certain stillness before the storm, an intentional moment where the air feels thick with the possibility of something going very wrong or very right, and you can't tell which way it will lean. That moment lingers just long enough for you to feel the beat of your own anticipation before it shatters beautifully into movement. A city in perpetual motion opens before us, its streets buzzing with a familiar hum of ambition and desperation. Every corner seems to be watching, waiting, and somewhere in this sprawling labyrinth, a plan is already in motion. What struck me immediately was the rhythm. The movie wastes no time, but also refuses to rush. It feels like watching a magician warm up, nothing overt yet, but you can sense the sleight of hand waiting in the wings. The ensemble we know, those magnetic personalities, are in place, but they're in flux. This isn't the same crew we remember. The edges have been sharpened, the bonds tested. There's a faint tension that seeps through their banter, an unspoken acknowledgement that they've been through things we haven't seen, and those things have left marks. The first spark comes in the form of an opportunity. It's not introduced like a thunderclap, but more like a whisper that catches the right ear. The sort of opportunity that feels too perfectly tailored, like someone somewhere knows exactly what bait to dangle. And yet, the allure is undeniable. The details of the job are deliciously vague at first, cloaked in just enough mystery to make it irresistible. That's always the danger. When something feels both inevitable and too good to be true, it rarely ends cleanly. The crew gathers in a place that feels like an extension of their collective personality, half refuge, half war room. The lighting here is low, warm in some corners, but casting long shadows in others. The geography of the space says everything about the people in it. Walls lined with trophies of past victories, small personal touches tucked away where only the observant would notice. The scene plays out with layers of subtext, inside jokes that carry an edge, quick glances that speak louder than the words being exchanged. And in between the easy rhythm of their dialogue, there's that undercurrent again, the sense that trust is not the solid ground it once was. When the plan is laid out, it's done with a kind of swagger that borders on performance art. The camera lingers not just on faces, but on hands, eyes, even the tilt of the head, each micro-expression betraying excitement, doubt, calculation. It's here that the first real fracture shows itself. A subtle disagreement, quickly smoothed over, but not forgotten. One member questions a detail, and the air shifts almost imperceptibly. The others move past it, but you can feel the seed has been planted. The action moves swiftly from planning to execution. The city becomes a character in its own right, alive, unpredictable, a mix of glittering promise and hidden threat. The pacing here is masterful. Each step toward the goal feels like part of a choreographed dance, and yet there's enough chaos to keep you from feeling entirely safe. The cinematography frames this perfectly, alternating between tight, almost claustrophobic shots that capture the pressure of the moment and wide, sweeping views that remind you the scale of the game being played. There's a sequence, brilliantly staged, that serves as both a spectacle and a quiet revelation. On the surface, it's all speed and precision. Quick movements, split-second decisions, the satisfying click of everything falling into place. But underneath, something else is happening. Small choices, almost invisible in the flurry of action, are made. Choices that seem minor now but will echo later in ways we can't yet see. This is where the film shows its literary sensibilities, layering events so that each moment works on multiple levels. Between these high-energy sequences, the movie breathes. And in those quieter spaces, the cracks widen. A private conversation here, a hesitation there. We see characters alone, unguarded, revealing fragments of thought they'd never share in the group. It's in these moments that I found myself most absorbed. The spectacle is dazzling, yes, but the human fragility beneath it is where the story's heartbeat lies. Midway through, the momentum builds toward a point of convergence. Multiple threads, some we've been following consciously, others woven so subtly into the background we barely noticed, begin to draw together. There's a meeting not entirely by chance. That changes the temperature of the whole story. A figure from the past appears, not with a dramatic flourish, but with a calm certainty that's even more unsettling. The dynamic shifts instantly. Smiles become tighter. The unspoken rules of the game are rewritten on the spot. What follows is a test, not of skill, but of cohesion. The crew is forced into a situation where quick thinking is useless without trust, and trust is precisely what's in shortest supply. Watching them navigate this is like watching a tightrope walker whose rope is fraying strand by strand. They make it across, for now, but the frayed ends remain. In one of the most memorable sequences so far, the plan they've been executing encounters an obstacle no one accounted for. It's not the kind of obstacle you can muscle through. It requires an improvisation that borders on reckless genius. And yet, in pulling it off, one of them crosses an unspoken line. The others notice. They don't speak of it, not yet, but the audience feels a tremor. From here, the pace shifts again, taking us into a quieter but no less intense terrain. The aftermath of their success or partial success, depending on how you measure it, is tinged with unease. They've gained something tangible, yes, but they've also traded pieces of themselves to get it. The celebratory energy is muted, shadowed by private calculations and unasked questions. There's a final image in this stretch that I can't shake. The crew together, physically close, yet somehow each person is alone. Their eyes aren't on each other. They're on the future, on the next move, on the potential fallout they won't admit they fear. The sense is clear. The story is far from over, but the foundation is already shifting beneath their feet. It begins in silence. Not the comfortable kind, not the warm quiet of friends catching their breath after a long day. This is a kind of silence that hums with things unsaid. The crew sits in the same space they have so many times before, but the air feels different now, heavier, almost static. Even the light seems altered, casting unfamiliar shadows on familiar walls. It's a small detail, yet it speaks volumes. Their latest victory, if you can even call it that, has cost them more than they'll admit aloud. The first fissure comes in the form of a disagreement disguised as casual conversation. One of them proposes the next move, a bold, risky leap into territory they've never dared touch. Another raises a quiet objection, their voice careful, even light, but the message is sharp enough to cut. The room stills. Every set of eyes turns toward the speaker, not in anger, but with that mix of curiosity and suspicion that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. You can tell this is the moment where lines are being drawn, whether anyone wants to admit it or not. From here, the plot threads begin to weave into something tighter, denser. The opportunity that sparked their journey earlier now reveals itself to be only one layer of a much larger, much more dangerous puzzle. Clues that seem random before begin to align. Bits of overheard dialogue, background faces in crowded scenes, even seemingly throwaway objects left in the frame a beat too long. The precision of it all is almost unnerving. You realize you've been playing catch-up along with the characters the entire time. There's a meeting arranged with an outside player, someone who operates in the shadows, so deep you'd almost swear they were part of the city itself. The exchange is brisk, almost cold, but its implications send ripples through the group. This new figure doesn't issue threats directly. What they offer instead is worse, a choice that feels like no choice at all. You can see it in the crew's eyes as they leave. No matter what path they pick, something essential will be lost. The next sequences are a masterclass in escalation. Plans are made, refined, and, at the worst possible moment, thrown out entirely. The city shifts from an ally to an adversary, its alleys and rooftops suddenly hostile, its neon promises now warning lights. There's a stretch where every movement feels hunted, even in broad daylight. Here, the cinematography presses in, tightening around the characters until you almost feel your own chest constricting. Amid this chaos, relationships begin to unravel. One of the quieter members of the crew makes a decision in secret, convinced they're protecting the others. But in truth, they're setting in motion a chain of events that no one will be able to fully control. Another starts questioning not just the plan, but the very nature of their bond, whether they've been working toward the same goal at all, or they've simply been sharing the same stage for their own separate performances. Then comes the pivot, the moment everything bends. It's not announced with fanfare. It happens in a quiet room, with no music, no witnesses beyond the two people involved. Words are exchanged that can't be taken back, confessions half-spoken, lies revealed not by what's said but by what's avoided. By the time the scene ends, the game has changed entirely. What was once a united front is now a fragile truce, held together by necessity rather than loyalty. The action that follows is sharper, more desperate. Every move they make now carries an edge of finality, as if each step might be the one that tips everything over. The obstacles they face are no longer clever puzzles. They're blunt, dangerous, and immediate. There's a chase sequence that is less about speed and more about survival, each turn of the camera revealing just how narrow the escape routes have become. When the inevitable confrontation arrives, it's not staged like a traditional climax. It's messy, unpredictable, and deeply personal. Every blow, every shouted word feels rooted in the weight of everything that's come before. Alliances shift mid-scene, trust shatters, and for a moment, you can't tell who's still in control, or if anyone is at all. The chaos reaches a fever pitch, and then, in one startling moment of stillness, it's over. Not neatly, not cleanly, but decisively. The aftermath is where the film truly earns its emotional weight. The survivors, whether physical or emotional, carry themselves differently now. Some are quieter, others harder. The streets they once navigated with ease now feel foreign, less like a home and more like a stage where they played their parts and overstayed their welcome. There's no grand speech, no triumphant music, just the knowledge that they've changed, and not all of it for the better. In the closing moments, the film circles back to a small visual motif from the beginning, a seemingly inconsequential detail that now lands with the force of revelation. It's a reminder of what was lost, what was gained, and what was left unresolved. The crew parts ways, not dramatically, but with the quiet finality of people who know their paths may never cross again, and if they do, it won't be the same. As the final frame fades, you're left with that rare feeling of satisfaction laced with unease. The story has reached its conclusion, but the echoes of it, those small, sharp fragments, linger long after. It's the kind of ending that stays with you, not because it ties everything up, but because it refuses to. The heart of this film isn't the plot, though it's clever, layered, and full of momentum, but the people, or perhaps more accurately, the personalities that inhabit it. Each one is a carefully crafted mix of contradictions, driven by instincts they can't always name, and choices they sometimes regret the moment they make them. Watching them, you begin to see the film less as a sequence of events and more as a shifting constellation of motivations, fears, and fragile loyalties. The unofficial leader moves with the kind of confidence that makes people follow, without needing to be asked. But that confidence isn't constant. It's punctured in small moments when the camera lingers on their eyes, catching the flicker of doubt they keep hidden from the crew. They wear their charisma like armor, but armor can crack, and here, the filmmakers let us see the strain beneath. You sense they are haunted by a past they'd rather outpace, but every bold choice they make seems to loop back to it, as if they can't quite cut the tether. Then there's a strategist, the quiet one, always observing, letting others fill the silence while they map every angle in their head. Their intelligence is sharp, surgical even, but what's fascinating is how emotion occasionally disrupts their precision. You watch them try to suppress it, to keep their plans pure and unclouded, but humanity leaks in, a look held too long, a hesitation in their voice, the faintest trace of protectiveness toward someone they claim is just a colleague. In those moments, their layers show not just a mind, but a heart that doesn't always want to stay hidden. The wild card is pure energy, but not without purpose. At first, you mistake their impulsiveness for recklessness, until you realize every outrageous stunt is calculated, not in a conventional sense, but in a way that keeps the crew's rhythm unpredictable. They're the spark that throws everyone off balance, and the crew needs that disruption more than they admit. Beneath the bravado, there's a constant need to prove their worth, to themselves most of all. The humor they throw around like confetti is a shield, and if you're paying attention, you can see the moments where the shield slips. The moral center of the group is a quieter, steadier presence, though moral here is a relative term. They're not above crossing lines, but they do so reluctantly, almost apologetically, as if keeping a running tally in some private ledger only they can see. It's their hesitations that make them compelling. They are living proof that loyalty doesn't always mean agreement. And when they do make a decisive move, it hits harder because you know how much they've waited beforehand. The newest member is perhaps the most intriguing, because they function as our mirror into the group. Their uncertainty, their awe, their moments of fear, these are the emotions we might feel in their place. But they're not passive. They're learning, adapting, shaping themselves to fit into the crew's rhythm, without losing all of who they are. Watching them transform is like watching a photograph slowly develop. What begins faint and indistinct becomes sharper, more defined, until suddenly you realize they've been part of the core all along. What makes these characters so rich is not just how they act, but how they react to one another. You see subtle power shifts in the way they stand in a room, in who speaks first and who listens longest. There's an unspoken hierarchy, but it's fluid. Leadership can change hands in a single exchange if the moment calls for it. This fluidity is part of what keeps the tension alive. No one is entirely safe in their role, and no dynamic is fixed. Their banter is more than comic relief. It's a currency. A joke here is not just a joke. It's a signal of trust, a way to diffuse danger, or sometimes a way to conceal deeper disagreements. In the same way, silence becomes a tool. When a character who is usually vocal falls quiet, you know something in the air has shifted, even if you don't yet know what. The film also understands that flaws are not weaknesses. They are gravitational forces. One stubbornness drags a crew into unnecessary risks. Another's mistrust keeps them from sharing critical information. But it's these same traits that, in other circumstances, save them. A flaw in one context becomes a strength in another, and the line between the two is constantly in motion. The turning points in the story aren't always about the external stakes. They're often rooted in the moment a character decides to do something that runs counter to their established pattern. The leader hesitates. The strategist takes an emotional risk. The wild card stays still instead of leaping. These moments feel electric because they upend what we think we know, forcing us to see the characters not as fixed archetypes, but as evolving beings. Even the antagonistic forces in the story are layered. They aren't painted as pure evil, but as people with their own logic, their own code. This makes the confrontations far more complex. Conflict here is not about good versus evil, but about clashing needs, incompatible visions of survival. The villain don't just oppose the crew. They reflect certain traits back at them, traits they'd rather not acknowledge in themselves. By the time the credits roll, you realize that the arcs are less about victory or defeat and more about self-awareness. Some emerge stronger, others more guarded, but none leave unchanged. The film leaves space for ambiguity. Relationships are not neatly mended. Trust is not fully restored, and the future is not entirely certain. And that's why these characters feel alive. Their stories don't end just because the film does. What lingers most, though, is the interplay of bonds and boundaries. The way they can betray each other in one moment and save each other in the next. It's messy, human, and deeply resonant. Long after the plot fade in memory, it's the faces, the glances, and the unspoken understandings that stay with you. There are moments when a film feels almost effortless on screen. Seamless shots, fluid pacing, characters moving through space as though the world was simply waiting for them to show up. But that's the illusion. Beneath the final polish, there's an entirely different story, one filled with unlikely accidents, behind-the-scenes rituals, whispered on-set superstitions, and those strange little truths that never make it into official press releases. This one was no exception. The first thing that surprised me, truly surprised me, was how much of the movie's charm and visual personality emerged from things that weren't even part of the original plan. I'm talking about moments that the filmmakers stumbled into by necessity rather than design. There was one sequence in particular, a high-energy chase that feels choreographed down to the millisecond, which was actually pieced together from several days of shooting in entirely different locations. The weather had been impossible, rain, wind, even a brief hailstorm, and instead of rescheduling the entire thing, the crew leaned into the chaos. They shot around it, embraced the inconsistencies, and in the end, those tiny shifts in lighting and scenery gave the chase a kind of kinetic unpredictability that no amount of planning could have manufactured. And then, there's the thing about the set design. You'd think that with a movie of this scope, every environment would be purpose-built, mapped out to the last brick or blade of grass. But here's the twist. Half of the most memorable interiors were scavenged from abandoned buildings that production designers borrowed for a few weeks. These spaces had histories, dusty, quiet, holding the weight of other stories. And the filmmakers didn't erase that, they amplified it. They left cracks in the walls, weathered textures, uneven floors. If you look closely during one of the key conversations, you can see faint remnants of graffiti from the building's previous life. They didn't scrub it away because it gave the space a lived-in authenticity that felt real in ways no soundstage could match. The cast had their own rhythms, too. Apparently, one of the leads had this peculiar pre-scene ritual. They would pace exactly 11 steps in one direction, pause, turn, and then retrace those steps. Not 10, not 12, 11. No one could figure out where it came from, and they wouldn't explain it. But you could see the way it grounded them, like a quiet countdown before diving into performance. Other actors had their own quirks. Someone always had to wear the same pair of socks for every scene shot indoors, claiming it was for continuity of spirit, whatever that means. Little things like that never make it into interviews, but they become part of the unspoken glue that holds a cast together. Some of the most startling facts, though, have to do with the sound. You'd expect the elaborate audio work, Foley effects, ambient noise, the hum of certain machines, to be created in a studio after filming. But for one stretch of the film, the director insisted on capturing as much as possible live on location. That decision created a logistical headache, but it paid off in unexpected ways. The footsteps you hear, they're not sound doubled. They're the real ones, echoing in real spaces. The background murmurs, the rustle of clothing, the clatter of distant objects. None of it is artificial. And that texture, that rawness, lends those scenes a sensory weight you don't notice until you start listening closely. Of course, not everything went smoothly. There was one day when filming had to stop completely because an actual stray animal wandered onto the set and decided it wasn't leaving. They tried coaxing it away with food, clapping, even music, but it just sat there perfectly content in the middle of a shot. Eventually, they rewrote a small moment in the scene to include it. Watching the finished film, you'd think the animal was placed there deliberately as a subtle background touch, but it was pure serendipity. And speaking of serendipity, one of the best-known shots, a quiet, lingering close-up that's become something of a fan favorite, only exists because the camera jammed during a take. The actor kept going, not realizing, and when the camera operator managed to free the mechanism, they caught the tail end of an unscripted moment. It was raw, unguarded, and had nothing to do with the official blocking. The director saw it in the dailies and immediately rearranged the scene so the shot would fit. Now, it's one of those moments that feels loaded with meaning, even though its origins were entirely accidental. Then there were the strange time constraints. Some key sequences were shot in less than half the scheduled time because a location suddenly became unavailable. Instead of the usual multiple takes from different angles, they had to choreograph everything so precisely that the camera movement, actor blocking, and lighting shifts all happened in one continuous dance. It could have been a disaster, but somehow, the pressure brought out this electric precision in everyone. You can feel it in the way the scene flows, like a single held breath from start to finish. The art department had its share of hidden treasures, too. Props were often sourced from real thrift shops and flea markets, and the crew developed a sort of unofficial competition to see who could find the most unexpected item to sneak into a scene. A certain table lamp you see in a background shot, it was bought for the equivalent of pocket change from a roadside sale 2 days before filming. A particular framed photograph glimpsed in one of the characters' homes, that's actually a candid from the cinematographer's family album, slipped in because they thought it added warmth. These things don't get noticed by the average viewer, but knowing they're there makes you want to rewatch and look closer. Even the pacing and production had its quirks. There were days when the crew was so far ahead of schedule that they'd invent entirely new shots just to fill the time, moments that didn't exist in the shooting script. Some of these were later cut in editing, but a few made it into the final version, and there's some of the most visually poetic beats in the whole film. Ironically, those unscripted inserts often carry more emotional resonance than the carefully plotted sequences. And then there's the unplanned weather. One scene, meant to take place on a warm, sunny afternoon, was filmed during an unexpected cold snap. Everyone's breath was visible in the air, and while they could try to disguise it, they embraced it instead. The scene became more somber, more grounded, simply because the character's physical discomfort mirrored the tension in the dialogue. It's one of those happy accidents that shifts the entire tone without rewriting a single word. Even craft services had its own legend. There was a certain snack, something homemade and entirely unremarkable by appearance. That became a kind of talisman for the crew. Supposedly, if a particular assistant didn't bring a fresh batch on set, something would go wrong that day. Everyone laughed about it, but they also kept track, and after 2 suspiciously bad shooting days without the snack, the superstition solidified into ritual. From that point on, it was always there, a quiet guardian of the shoot. It's strange, isn't it? The way a film can be shaped as much by these odd, unpredictable elements as by the deliberate artistry of the director, writer, and cast. Watching the finished product, you'd never guess how much of its rhythm came from chance, necessity, or superstition. But in a way, that's what makes it special. Because every time you watch, you're seeing not just a polished story, but the echoes of everything that happened when the cameras weren't rolling. It's funny how certain films refuse to stay still in your mind. You walk out of theater thinking you've got a neat, tidy grasp of the story, the tone, the way it made you feel. But then hours later, something starts tapping on the inside of your head. A line you thought was throwaway suddenly seems heavier. A small gesture you barely noticed on first viewing blooms into something layered. That's the thing with this one. It lingers, but not politely. It leaves fingerprints. The major events of the film unfold with this strange blend of inevitability and surprise. You know from the way the early scenes are built, tight framing, lingering silences, that things are going to unravel, and yet when they do, the unraveling doesn't follow the usual threads. The first of these turning points happens during what initially feels like a transitional scene. No one shouting, no explosions, no dramatic camera swoop. Just a conversation in a dimly lit space that we visited before. But this time, the light falls differently, casting shadows that feel almost like characters themselves, eavesdropping. And it's here that a character lets something slip. Not a confession exactly, but a tilt in the way they tell their story that suddenly reframes what we thought we knew. From a critical standpoint, this moment works because it's not loud. In fact, it's almost aggressively quiet. We've been trained to expect big reveals to be announced, to arrive like fireworks, but here the filmmakers choose the opposite. The reveal hides in a small crack of dialogue, forcing the audience to work for it. And that's part of the film's ethos, an insistence that meaning is something you have to lean into here. Another pivotal event arrives midway through, wrapped in the disguise of a genre trope. On the surface, it looks like a set piece you've seen before, a gathering, tense but civil, with underlying stakes no one dares to say out loud. The camera moves in steady, almost glacial arch around the table, studying faces like a patient anthropologist. This is where the power shifts. We watch as alliances wobble, as eyes flick toward doors and windows, as someone's hand trembles slightly while lifting a glass. The brilliance here is that nothing happens in the action sense. No overt betrayal, no sudden departure. But by the time the scene ends, the emotional geometry of the story has been redrawn. It's worth noting that the film doesn't treat these shifts as isolated beats. They ripple. That's what makes the later events so much more potent. A seemingly unrelated confrontation in a busy public space gains a quiet, sharp edge because we remember the table scene. A moment of stillness between two characters, one reaching for the other's sleeve, carries more gravity because of the earlier half-confession in the shadows. This is what great narrative architecture does. It doesn't just build moments, it builds the pathways between them. One of the most talked about sequences, already dissected endlessly in early critical chatter, is a late film confrontation that plays out in near total silence. It's almost experimental in its restraint. Two characters meet in a space where their voices should echo, but the sound design strips nearly everything away. You hear only what's absolutely unavoidable. The faint shuffle of shoes, the intake of breath, a distant metallic creak. It's the kind of scene that forces you to inhabit the moment with them, to feel every micro-expression, every hesitation. When the inevitable clash comes, not with fists or weapons, but with words so carefully chosen they land like physical blows, it's devastating precisely because we've been held in that quiet so long. From a thematic perspective, that scene encapsulates one of the film's strongest undercurrents. The idea that real conflict isn't always about action. It's about the erosion of understanding, the slow, quiet fractures between people. By stripping away the noise, the filmmakers let us hear the breaking. There's another event that deserves mention, though it's not as obviously big as the others. A small, almost invisible moment where a background character makes a choice that changes the trajectory of the main plot. You might not even catch it the first time. A glance, a step taken toward the wrong person at the wrong moment. But it's there, and if you re-watch with that in mind, it becomes one of the film's most elegant narrative sleights of hand. Critics have already pointed out how this small beat threads back into the climax in a way that feels both earned and invisible, and it's hard not to admire the craft in that. Now, about the climax itself, it's the kind of sequence that makes you think you've seen the final shape of the story, only to pull the rug out from under you in the last few minutes. It's not a cheap twist, not one of those surprise for surprise's sake endings. No, this is the kind that retroactively re-anchors the entire film. Suddenly you realize that certain lines, certain looks, certain absences were not gaps in storytelling. They were signposts. The ending doesn't rewrite the story so much as let you see it from the correct angle for the first time. Emotionally, it's disarming. I remember sitting there as the credits began to roll, thinking not about the resolution itself, but about all the moments earlier that now felt different. That's the mark of a story that knows its own shape. It leaves you wanting to immediately go back to the beginning. Not because you missed something obvious, but because you now know what questions to ask. Critically speaking, what makes these events so effective is how they're tied to the film's thematic backbone. This isn't a story about plot points in isolation. It's about transformation, perception, and the moral blur between right and wrong. Each event is a pivot, not toward a neat resolution, but toward a deeper ambiguity. You're never handed a simple moral takeaway, and that refusal to tidy things up is exactly why the film resonates. Thematically, the events circle around a few core ideas: loyalty, deception, self-preservation, but they do so without ever settling into cliché. There's a sense that the filmmakers are more interested in the cost of these concepts than in celebrating them. Loyalty here isn't pure, it's compromised. Deception isn't glamorous, it's corrosive. And self-preservation isn't painted as a choice between survival and morality. It's shown as a constant negotiation, one that leaves marks no matter what you choose. The reception so far reflects this complexity. Viewers who want clean resolutions have found it frustrating, even alienating. But those who relish ambiguity, who enjoy wrestling with a story rather than having it delivered fully assembled, have embraced it with near-religious fervor. I've seen entire discussions devoted to just one line from the penultimate scene, with interpretations ranging from optimistic to fatalistic. And that's the beauty of it. It invites argument, disagreement, conversation. For me, the lasting impact comes from the way the events layer meaning. You can watch it once and follow the surface-level narrative easily enough, but the real reward comes from sitting with it afterwards, letting the connections reveal themselves slowly. It's a film that trusts you to pay attention, to remember, to hold on to fragments until they find their place. And when they do, it's like watching a mosaic come into focus, not perfectly symmetrical, but undeniably whole. There's a quiet courage in making a film like that. It asks more of its audience than most. It requires patience, attention, and a willingness to accept that some threads will remain frayed. But in return, it gives you something rare, a story that doesn't just fade when the lights come up, but keeps moving in your mind, reshaping itself with every recollection. That's why, when I think back on those significant events, not just the obvious, dramatic ones, but the subtle beats hiding in plain sight, I don't think of them as isolated moments. I think of them as echoes, overlapping and resonating long after the screen goes dark. And maybe that's the most powerful thing a film can do. Not tell you exactly what to feel, but leave you with the space to feel in your own time, in your own way. I've always believed that a finished film is only half the story. The other half is what happens when the cameras aren't rolling, or at least when they're not rolling on that particular scene. And with this one, there's something especially charming about how the production unfolded. It wasn't the sterile, hyper-polished set that you sometimes imagine for big-budget projects. It had rough edges, human quirks, and moments so strangely perfect they couldn't have been scripted if they tried. The filmmaking process itself felt like an act of trust. From the earliest table reads, You could sense that the cast and crew had been invited into something more collaborative than the average production. The director wasn't the sort to lock themselves in a monitor tent and bark orders. No, they walked the floor, crouched beside actors, whispered adjustments so softly it felt conspiratorial. There was a lot of laughter between takes, but it wasn't the brittle, nervous kind. It was a relaxed, lived-in laughter of people who knew they were making something special. And that collaborative spirit ran deep. One of the camera operators told me about a moment during a pivotal scene when a light caught the actor's face in such a way that the whole crew froze. Everyone knew it was beautiful, but also knew it wasn't planned. Instead of cutting, the director gave a tiny wave to keep rolling, and the actor, completely unaware, leaned just slightly into that beam. It was pure serendipity, the kind of thing you can't choreograph, and it ended up being one of film's most striking visual beats. Later, they admitted they almost didn't use it because it looked too perfect, like a painting. But in the end, they trusted the moment. The production days weren't without their hiccups. In fact, some of the most fascinating behind-the-scenes stories come from the times when things went wrong. There was one outdoor sequence where the weather had been stable for days, clear skies, gentle breeze. And then, just as the scene began rolling, the wind picked up like it had been waiting for its cue. Props started shifting. A carefully placed tablecloth took flight, and a background extra had their hat whipped clean off their head. The whole thing was chaos for about 30 seconds. But here's the strange part. When they reviewed the footage, they realized the wind gave the scene an entirely new kind of energy. The director made the bold decision to rewrite a small part of the next scene to accommodate the wind incident, as if it had been intentional all along. It worked so well you'd think it had been storyboarded months in advance. The crew had their rituals, too. Every morning started with what they called the minute of silence, which was exactly what it sounded like, a single uninterrupted minute where no one spoke. Phones were off, and you could hear only the hum of the lights and the shuffling of feet finding their marks. Some said it helped focus everyone. Others said it was just a way to delay the inevitable chaos of the day. But whatever the reason, it became a non-negotiable. Even visiting producers had to observe it. One of my favorite anecdotes came from a particularly long night shoot. The scene was emotionally intense, requiring the lead actor to deliver a monologue in a single, continuous take. After 4 exhausting tries, the crew decided to take a short break. During that pause, the caterer, a quiet, unassuming figure most people hadn't paid much attention to, started humming a lullaby from their childhood. The sound drifted across the set, soft and steady, and something about it seemed to reset the actor's energy. On the very next take, they nailed it. The caterer didn't say a word about it, just kept serving coffee. But the crew started joking that they should get a co-director credit. The production wasn't shy about using unconventional methods to get the performances they wanted. For one crucial scene involving a heated argument, the director didn't call action at all. Instead, they had the actors improvise a completely unrelated conversation about something mundane, breakfast foods. If you can believe it, without warning, they steered the dialogue into the scripted material, catching the actors slightly off balance. That rawness, the tiny beats of hesitation, made it into the final cut, and it's one of the reasons the scene feels so alive. Not all the fun facts are tied to accidents or improvisation. Some were baked into the film from the start. For instance, there's a subtle motif that only the crew seemed fully aware of during shooting. A particular color that kept appearing in background objects, props, and even clothing. It wasn't obvious enough for most viewers to notice consciously, but it gave the film an invisible thread of cohesion. The set decorators took this detail seriously. One even admitted to repainting a minor prop at the last minute to make sure it fit the palette. There were also tiny in-jokes sprinkled throughout the set, known only to those who worked on it. In one scene, a background sign is actually a nod to the cinematographer's first short film. In another, a throwaway line from a supporting character is a direct quote from something a grip said on day 1 of shooting. None of these moments are essential to understanding the story, but they give the film a hidden second life for anyone who knows where to look. Then there's the story of the lost prop. Midway through the shoot, a small but important object, a piece that would be key in a later scene, went missing. The entire crew searched for nearly an hour, only to discover that the prop master had accidentally taken it home in their bag. By the time they returned the next day, the director had rewritten the relevant scene to accommodate its absence, and, ironically, the version without the prop ended up being more effective. The missing prop still made a cameo later on, but now as a sort of Easter egg, tucked into a corner of the frame. Of course, filming days often stretch far longer than scheduled. One veteran gaffer told me that the difference between a good shoot and a great one often comes down to how the crew handles exhaustion. On this set, they handled it with food, endless trays of snacks, yes, but also elaborate running jokes about them. By the end of production, certain snacks had been given names, backstories, even imagined rivalries. There was a whole subplot about the villainy of the last bag of salt and vinegar chips, which somehow survived to the wrap party. Speaking of the wrap party, it's worth mentioning that it wasn't the usual quick speeches and champagne affair. Instead, they projected a behind-the-scenes reel that had been secretly compiled throughout the shoot. It was full of outtakes, candid moments, and entirely unplanned laughter, booms dipping into frame, someone forgetting their line, and making up a ridiculous one instead, crew members photobombing serious takes. Watching that reel, you could see the bones of production, the shared exhaustion, the small victories, the way people leaned on each other. And maybe that's the most revealing part about this film's creation. It was built not just on technical skill or meticulous planning, but on a web of human connection. The things that could have been irritants, bad weather, missing props, long hours, became opportunities for invention. The accidents didn't derail the vision. They fed it. The finished film feels seamless, but knowing how it was made, you realize that its polish comes from an embrace of imperfection. Even now, months after filming wrapped, some of the crew still meet up, sometimes to work on other projects, sometimes just to share a drink and trade stories. And every so often, someone will bring up a moment from the set, and you'll see that glimmer in their eyes, the recognition that they were part of something rare, the kind of production where the stories behind the camera are just as rich as the ones in front of it. The first time I saw the opening shot, I noticed something odd. It wasn't just about what was in the frame. It was about how invited I felt. The scene was wide and unhurried, as if the director was saying, "Take your time, settle in." The setting wasn't just backdrop. It was a living participant in the story. Every building, every scrap of litter in the street, every flicker of light from a distant window seemed to have a history. You could almost imagine what had happened there before the characters arrived, and what would keep happening long after they were gone. The primary location, though the film shifted between several, had a curious duality. By day, it was warm a way that tricked you into feeling safe. Sun streaming through dust-speckled air, quiet corners where conversations felt private. But at night, the same space could turn sharp-edged, with shadows spilling across the floor like they were hiding something. The cinematographer clearly understood this transformation, because the lighting shifted not just in brightness, but in texture. Daylight scenes had a softness to them. The camera seemed to linger a little longer, letting your eyes drink in the warmth. But at night, the visuals tightened. Edges became more pronounced, movements quicker, as if the world itself was holding its breath. There was one particular location that still haunts me, a narrow, uneven alley that curved slightly so you couldn't see where it ended. It appeared several times, each with a different emotional tone. The first time, it felt playful, a space the characters darted through, laughing. The second, it was tense, shadows clinging to the walls, the camera keeping a low angle, almost crouching with them. And later, it became almost ceremonial, a place of reckoning. This wasn't just clever reuse of a set. It was thematic layering. The alley became a kind of silent witness to the film's emotional shifts, a visual metaphor that deepened each time it returned. The film's secondary locations were no less carefully considered. A sterile corporate office wasn't just shot as a bland box. It was lit with an unnerving balance of symmetry and emptiness. Desks perfectly aligned, glass walls that reflected more than they revealed, chairs pushed in just a little too precisely. It gave you that quiet, skin-prickling feeling that someone was always watching, even when the room was empty. The rural settings, brief but memorable, were drenched in earth tones, with subtle grain in the film texture that made them feel almost tactile. There was one sunrise shot that lingered on a half-collapsed barn, its roof sagging like a tired animal. The choice to shoot it in golden hour light wasn't just for beauty. It underscored the idea that beauty and decay could coexist, that the past wasn't gone so much as it was quietly blending into the present. What really struck me, though, was how the setting was allowed to speak in silence. Some of the most powerful sequences had no score at all, just the ambient sounds of the environment, the echo of footsteps on wet pavement, the distant hiss of traffic, the whisper of wind through an open window. That kind of restraint takes confidence. The director trusted the audience to feel without being told what to feel, and the sound team made sure every creak and rustle was placed with surgical precision. The cinematography followed this philosophy. The camera didn't always chase the action. Sometimes it seemed to wait for characters to arrive in the frame, as though the world was there first, and the people were just moving through it. When the camera did move, it wasn't random. It was like a dance partner, leading gently in some moments, letting itself be led in others. Slow push-ins gave conversations a quiet intensity. Sudden handheld jolts mirrored moments of emotional upheaval. One of my favorite visual techniques in the film was the way reflections were used, not just in mirrors, but in puddles, windows, even the surface of a coffee cup. Sometimes the reflection was clear, sometimes warped, but it always seemed to hint at duality. The person as they saw themselves versus how the world saw them. It was subtle enough that you could miss it if you weren't paying attention, but once you noticed, it became a thread running through the entire film. Color grading played its own role in shaping the atmosphere. The palette shifted almost imperceptibly as the story unfolded. Early scenes were richer, more saturated, as if the world was full of possibility. As tensions rose, colors cooled, shadows deepened, and even daylight scenes took on a slight pallor, suggesting that something was slipping away. By the final act, the hues were almost drained, yet in the very last moments, a tiny spark of color returned, enough to make you wonder if hope had quietly survived after all. It wasn't just the big set pieces that made the world convincing. It was the micro details. A cracked tile in the kitchen that no one commented on, but your eye caught anyway. The graffiti in the background that hinted at a subplot we never saw. A cluttered desk with papers spilling out of a drawer, the kind of imperfection that makes a space feel lived in. These touches didn't scream for attention, but they built trust. You believed these places existed before the camera ever arrived. Even the weather seemed to conspire with the storytelling. Rain wasn't used in the cliched, sad scene way. It sometimes fell during moments of hope, washing everything clean, or during moments of chaos, blurring the lines between friend and foe. Sunlight wasn't always warm. In one striking scene, it was blinding and oppressive, forcing a character to squint as though the truth itself was too bright to face. The visual language extended to how characters interacted with their environments. Some seemed to own the spaces they entered, moving with ease, leaning against walls, touching objects without hesitation. Others hovered at thresholds, reluctant to commit, their body language telling you everything about their relationship to place. The camera respected these rhythms. It didn't intrude, but it didn't stand back too far either. It found the sweet spot where you felt like you were sharing the space with them. By the time the credits rolled, you realized the settings had done more than host a story. They had shaped it. The city streets had taught the characters caution and resilience. The rural landscapes had reminded them, and us, of fragility and time. The intimate interiors had stripped away pretense, forcing moments of raw truth. It's the kind of visual storytelling that lingers, because you don't just remember what happened. You remember where it happened and how it felt to be there. And maybe that's why, days later, I found myself thinking less about individual plot twists and more about the sensory memory of the film. The cool shade under an overpass. The way lamplight pooled on rain-slicked asphalt. The quiet of an empty room just before someone entered. It wasn't nostalgia exactly. It was more like the film had managed to plant pieces of its world inside me, and now they were mine to carry. From the outside, filming might look like an orderly process. Storyboards call sheets perfectly timed setups. But the truth is, a set is a living, breathing organism. It has moods. Some days it's electric, buzzing with laughter and creative adrenaline. Other days it's sluggish, waiting for cloud to pass or a stubborn light to stop flickering. This production was no exception. One of my earliest mental snapshots from this set is of the cast crammed together between takes, sitting on mismatched folding chairs in what had once been a storage room. It smelled faintly of paint and strong coffee. They weren't running lines or rehearsing. They were debating the merits of a particular snack that the catering truck had introduced that week. It sounds trivial, but moments like that shape the energy that ends up on screen. You could feel how comfortable they were with one another, how the laughter came easy. Later, watching certain scenes, you could see traces of those same easy smiles and the way the characters traded glances. Of course, comfort didn't mean there weren't challenges. The film had several large-scale sequences involving intricate camera movements and multiple extras, which meant timing had to be exact. There was one day, well, technically it stretched into 2 days, where the crew tried to capture a key scene involving a moving vehicle, a crowd, and a crane shot that needed to sweep in perfectly as a character delivered a single line. Every time, something went wrong. Sometimes it was the timing of the vehicle. Sometimes an extra looked directly into the camera. Once, the crane arm groaned so loudly mid-swing that everyone burst out laughing and had to reset. By the 17th take, the crew had that glazed, surreal look you get when you're so tired it's funny. But on the 18th try, it just clicked. The camera swept, the line landed, and the entire set broke into applause. Not the polite, we're professionals kind, but the relieved, slightly delirious kind that comes from surviving an ordeal together. Between those long, technically demanding days, there were lighter ones where improvisation ruled. A particular scene, written as a quick exchange, became one of the most memorable in the movie simply because 2 of the actors went off script in a way that made everyone on set freeze, then quietly gesture to keep rolling. Later, the director admitted that what they captured in that moment carried more emotional truth than the original dialogue. That bit of spontaneity stayed in the final cut. Then there were the unplanned creatures. The film shot several outdoor sequences, and nature, as always, refused to read the call sheet. There was a curious stray dog who wandered into frame during a tense conversation and plopped down between the leads like he belonged there. The take was ruined, technically, but no one could stop laughing, especially when the dog refused to leave until bribed with a granola bar. Another time, a low-flying bird decided to photobomb a dramatic sunset shot, soaring across the frame so perfectly centered it looked intentional. The director kept that one. Weather was its own unpredictable co-star. On paper, the schedule accounted for sunny days in certain locations. Reality had other plans. One particularly crucial scene had to be filmed in pouring rain. Not cinematic, artful rain, but cold, sideways, soak-your-socks rain. The crew scrambled to shield equipment. The actors' costumes became heavy with each take, and you could hear teeth chattering between lines. Yet when they played the footage back, something about the rawness worked. The discomfort translated into a kind of urgency that elevated the entire scene. It's a reminder that sometimes a setback is just an undiscovered advantage. Inside the studio, the challenges were different. One elaborate set piece, a cramped, detail-heavy room meant to look like it had been lived in for decades, was built entirely from scratch. The set decorators didn't just scatter props. They layered history into the space. They brought in photographs aged by hand, half-used notebooks with actual handwriting in them. Even dust they'd mixed from flour and powdered pigment to get the perfect texture. On shooting days, the space felt weirdly real. Crew members found themselves moving carefully, as if they might bump into an actual resident coming back from errands. The authenticity seeped into performances. The actors said it was easy to forget they were in a studio because the room had its own quiet weight. That immersive quality wasn't always easy to maintain. There was one day where a lighting rig failed mid-take, plunging half the set into shadow. Instead of calling a halt, the director whispered to the cinematographer, "Let's keep it. Play into it." They adjusted on the fly, blocking the rest of the scene, so that the encroaching darkness mirrored the emotional shift in the characters. Watching the final cut, you'd never guess it came from a malfunction. It looked intentional, even poetic. Interactions among cast and crew were one of production's secret strengths. The director had a habit of holding small, end-of-day gatherings, nothing formal, just people sitting on crates or leaning against equipment, talking through what had worked and what hadn't. Everyone, from the lead actors to the youngest production assistant, had space to speak. It fostered a kind of collective ownership over the project. If a grip suggested a slight change to camera blocking, it was genuinely considered. If a costume assistant noticed a continuity slip, it was fixed without fuss. That collaborative spirit infused the set with a rare kind of humility. You felt that everyone was working toward the same vision. There was also a running joke involving a prop that never actually made it to the screen. It was a small, odd-looking ceramic cat statue, part of the background dressing for one of the sets. Somehow it kept getting moved. Sometimes it was on a shelf, sometimes in a window, once balanced precariously on a radiator. No one admitted to relocating it, but it became a kind of scavenger hunt each morning. The crew started taking bets on where it would appear next. Eventually, the director confessed to being the culprit, using it as a low-key way to keep morale high during long weeks of shooting. As for the moments that didn't make it into the movie, there were many. Whole scenes cut for pacing, moments that the crew loved, but that didn't quite fit the flow. There's always a bittersweetness to that. One assistant editor described it as packing for a trip. You can't take everything you love, so you bring what served the journey best. But those deleted moments still live on in the memories of the people who were there. By the end of filming, the set had developed its own microculture. Inside jokes were embedded in call sheets. Certain songs played over the PA became unofficial anthems. There was a board near the craft services table where people left little sketches, notes, or cryptic quotes from the day's work. On the final night, someone took it down, rolled it up, and quietly handed it to the director as a keepsake. When you watch the finished film, you see the polish, the smooth transitions, the seamless performances, the carefully measured tone. What you don't see are the cold toes in the rain, the 2 a.m. lighting fixes, the impromptu prop hunts, the laughter over coffee in a storage room. But those things are in there in the sense that they live underneath the surface of the movie like an unspoken rhythm. You feel them even if you don't consciously know why. And that's the thing about behind-the-scenes stories. They're not just trivia. They're the quiet proof that filmmaking is as much about the messy, unpredictable human experience as it is about what ends up on screen. You might leave a theater remembering a dramatic line or a perfectly framed shot, but somewhere inside that memory is also the echo of a crew clapping at take 18, a ceramic cat moving to the set like a ghost, and a director smiling in the rain because the scene was finally unexpectedly perfect. What fascinated me about this story wasn't just its plot mechanics, though those ticked along with a kind of deliberate clockwork precision. It was the way the filmmakers seemed to plan invisible threads that ran underneath everything. You don't notice them right away. They tug quietly, almost imperceptibly, guiding you to think a certain way, to feel a certain way about the characters and their choices before you can even rationalize why. One of the most prominent threads was redemption, not the glossy, Hollywood kind where a character makes one grand gesture and suddenly their sins are wiped clean, but the messier, ongoing kind, the kind that's lived in small acts, half-finished apologies, and decisions that cost something real. The characters here are not saints in waiting. They stumble, they regress, they choose selfishness as often as they choose generosity. But the theme of redemption keeps surfacing, sometimes in the form of a visual callback, other times through a repeated line of dialogue that gains new weight each time it's spoken. And speaking of repetition, that's one of the film's key symbolic devices. Certain images recur in different contexts, shifting meaning as the story unfolds. An object that first appears as a throwaway detail comes back later in a moment of crisis. No longer just a prop, but a marker of change. You start to realize that the film is teaching you to pay attention, to see how even the smallest things are woven into the larger arc of transformation. Light and shadow play their own quiet game here. The cinematography isn't just about mood. It's about moral geography. Scenes shot in full, unbroken light almost always accompany moments of honesty, however uncomfortable. Conversely, shadowed frames, half-lit faces, or backgrounds swallowed in darkness tend to coincide with deception, internal conflict, or unspoken truth. There's a particularly striking scene where a character is lit from behind, their face completely in silhouette. It's not just beautiful, it's loaded with meaning. This is someone whose intentions are still obscured, even to themselves. Another recurring visual motif is the use of reflective surfaces, mirrors, windows, even puddles. On the surface, sure, It's a clever way to compose a shot, but thematically it ties to the idea of self-perception versus how others see us. There's one sequence where a character stares into a cracked mirror, the fractured reflection lining up imperfectly with their real face. It's not subtle, but it's effective. It's the cinematic equivalent of saying, "This is who I am, and this is who I'm trying to be," and the pieces don't quite fit. Color theory is another subtle player in the symbolic landscape. The palette shifts gradually over the course of the film. Early scenes lean into cooler tones, blues, grays, muted greens, suggesting detachment, caution, and unspoken tension. As the characters' arcs progress and connections deepen, warmer tones begin to seep in, rust, amber, deep gold. By the end, you notice that even the background details in crowd scenes carry this warmth. It's not a sudden shift. It's a slow burn, mirroring the character's internal thaw. What's particularly satisfying is how these thematic and symbolic elements don't feel like they've been laid on top of the story. They're baked in. You could strip away the plot entirely and still sense the underlying movement of the themes. In fact, the film almost feels like it could exist as a silent piece, relying entirely on its visual and symbolic language to communicate meaning. The tension between freedom and control is another idea threaded throughout. Characters are constantly negotiating boundaries between personal desire and collective responsibility, between instinct and restraint. This is symbolized most vividly through physical barriers in the set design, doorways, fences, lines painted on the ground. They're never just there for realism. They're thresholds, moments of choice. One scene involving a literal lock gate serves as both a practical obstacle and a metaphor for the emotional blockade a character has built. Time, too, becomes a symbolic presence. Watches, clocks, and timepieces appear in the background more often than you realize until you start counting. Some are broken, stuck in a specific moment. Others tick relentlessly. The editing even mimics this obsession with time. There are sequences where cuts speed up, mirroring a racing heartbeat, and others where the camera lingers, stretching seconds into minutes. All of it reinforces the idea that time in this world is both a pressure and a gift. There's also a quiet undercurrent of the natural world, reclaiming space. Plants sprouting through cracks in concrete, birds nesting in abandoned structures, vines creeping along walls. At first, they feel like set dressing, pretty atmospheric. But as the story unfolds, you start to see the parallel. People, too, have a way of growing in unexpected places, of pushing to the confines placed around them. On a more personal note, one of the things that struck me hardest was the film's handling of moral ambiguity. So often, stories draw clean lines. This person is good, this one bad. Here, the lines blur constantly. Someone you're rooting for makes a choice that makes you flinch. Someone you mistrust does something selfless. This thematic choice is mirrored in the score itself. The composer uses dissonant chords under moments of supposed triumph and warm, melodic themes during scenes of conflict. It's as if the film is reminding you not to get too comfortable with your assumptions. Even the physical movement of characters carries symbolic weight. Watch closely, and you'll notice that those who are emotionally open tend to move freely through space, gesturing widely, crossing rooms without hesitation, while those burdened by secrets keep their movements tight, constrained. This changes as the plot progresses. By the end, some of those previously rigid characters are striding across the frame, while others have folded inward. It's body language as thematic storytelling. Dialogue also plays into the symbolic layering. Certain words or phrases repeat in different mouths, slightly altered each time, like refrains in a song. The repetition builds a sense of inevitability, as if the story's events are part of a larger, unspoken pattern. And when a line finally breaks from that pattern, when a character says something unexpected, it lands with real impact, like a note in a melody you didn't realize you've been humming all along. One of the more subtle thematic touches comes in the form of absence, things that are never shown or said. Whole backstories are hinted at but never confirmed. Key events happen off-screen, with only their emotional fallout visible. This forces you to fill in the gaps, and in doing so, you become complicit in the storytelling. Your own assumptions become part of the film's symbolic fabric. And perhaps my favorite symbol of all, a recurring small object, seemingly inconsequential, that travels quietly from scene to scene. Sometimes it's in a pocket, sometimes on a table, sometimes glimpsed in the background. Its journey mirrors the character's own, and when it finally lands in the hands of someone unexpected, it's like the closing of a loop you didn't realize had been open since the beginning. The beauty of all this is how seamlessly these thematic and symbolic layers connect to the plot and characters. The story isn't just something that happens to them. It's an environment they move through, one rich with meaning. Every choice, every setting, every recurring visual tells you something about who they are and where they're headed. By the time the credits roll, you may not have consciously tracked every symbol or motif, but you felt them. They've done their quiet work, guiding your emotional journey alongside the characters. And that, I think, is the real artistry here. The themes aren't preaching at you. The symbols aren't screaming for attention. They're woven in like the grain of wood, integral, natural, beautiful precisely because they're part of the structure itself. You leave not just remembering the story, but carrying pieces of its unseen architecture with you, like the faint scent of a place you once visited and can't quite forget. The first time I saw the finished cut, I remember sitting there in the dark, knowing full well that I'd just been manipulated, in the best way possible. The director and crew had crafted something so immersive that I wasn't just observing the story. I was inside it. That's the quiet power of filmmaking techniques done right. They don't just tell you a story, they orchestrate your experience of it. The camera work here is deceptively simple on the surface. No overindulgence in flashy drone shots just for the sake of spectacle. No frantic editing to mask weak moments. But look closer and you'll see the sophistication. Slow, measured dolly movements in scenes of tension, giving you the feeling that you're being drawn deeper, whether you want to or not. Wide shots that hold for a beat too long, forcing you to notice details in the frame you might have missed otherwise, like the nervous shifting of a character's hands or the slow spill of light across a wall. One of my favorite moments comes during a heated confrontation. Instead of cutting rapidly between faces, the camera stays locked on one character for an uncomfortably long stretch as the other speaks off-screen. It's a choice that subtly shifts your focus. You're not just hearing the words, you're watching the effect they have. This restraint in editing makes you feel the emotional weight instead of simply registering it. Lighting design is another quiet hero here. The film doesn't chase glossy perfection. Instead, it embraces imperfection. Shadows that crawl into corners, light that flickers and dies, the way sunlight can turn harsh and almost blinding in moments of truth. This isn't about beauty in the conventional sense. It's about atmosphere. And atmosphere is everything. Without saying a word, lighting tells you whether a space is safe or dangerous, whether a character's inner world is opening up or shutting down. The sound design deserves its own kind of applause. Not just for the score, but for meticulous layering of ambient noise. You can hear the rustle of clothing when someone shifts in their chair, the distant hum of the city outside a half-closed window, the tiny hitch in a breath before a character lies. None of it is accidental. These details create intimacy. You feel like you're eavesdropping on something private. And when the score does come in, it's never overbearing. Sometimes it's a single sustained note that seems to hover in the air, sometimes a low, almost imperceptible bass pulse that you feel in your chest before you consciously notice it. There's one sequence where the music builds and then cuts out entirely, leaving only the sound of footsteps echoing in an empty hallway. And that silence hits harder than any crescendo could have. Editing style plays a huge role in shaping the emotional rhythm. The film alternates between giving you breathing space and then snatching it away. Just when you've settled into a scene, a sharp cut throws you somewhere unexpected. But it's not chaos. It's calculated disruption, mirroring the character's own instability. In more reflective scenes, the cuts stretch out, letting you sit in the quiet, almost daring you to grow restless. It's a push-and-pull relationship that keeps you engaged without feeling manipulated. The production design works in harmony with all this. Sets feel lived in, books stacked unevenly on shelves, scuffs on floors, mismatched furniture that looks like it's been accumulated over years rather than assembled in a week. These details might seem trivial, but they matter. They keep you from slipping into the mindset of, oh, I'm watching a movie set. Instead, you feel like you're peering into a real, breathing world. Then there's the blocking, the choreography of how actors move within a space. In one scene, two characters are arguing in a cramped kitchen. Instead of staying static, They circle each other slowly, their paths crossing and diverging like an unspoken dance. The camera moves with them, subtly reinforcing the tension between them. In another scene, a character stands apart from the group, framed by a doorway. They're part of the picture, but also separate, a visual cue that mirrors their emotional isolation. All of these techniques aren't just for style. They shape the atmosphere in ways you feel more than consciously notice. It's the reason you lean forward during certain scenes and relax back into your seat during others. It's why a quiet moment feels heavy with meaning, or why an action sequence feels breathless without needing shaky cam theatrics. On the production side, there's a whole other story. Budget allocation played a surprisingly creative role. Instead of pouring resources into massive CGI spectacles, the production leaned on practical effects and location shooting, which gave the film a grounded, tactile quality. You can see it in the texture walls, the grain of wooden surfaces, the way light plays differently in a real room versus a green screen environment. The box office performance was, in many ways, shaped by these creative choices. Marketing leaned into the film's sense of depth and craftsmanship, which resonated with audiences tired of formula. It didn't open with record-breaking numbers, but it had legs, the kind of slow-burn success where word of mouth keeps the seats filled long after the initial hype fades. Critics praised not just the story but the experience of watching it, noting how the technical execution elevated the material. The distribution strategy also played smartly into its strengths. Instead of saturating every theater possible, they chose a staggered release, allowing buzz to build in key markets before expanding. This mirrored the pacing of the film itself, a deliberate escalation rather than a full-on rush. And when the international release rolled out, they tailored marketing to highlight the film's visual and atmospheric strengths, knowing that those elements translate universally, even when dialogue doesn't. But perhaps the most telling thing is how audiences described their viewing experience afterward. People didn't just talk about the plot. They talked about moments. A glance across a crowded room, the way rain sounded against a metal roof in a tense silence, the shift in color temperature between two back-to-back scenes. These are the fingerprints of careful filmmaking, the result of hundreds of decisions you never see but always feel. Looking back, I think that's why this film sticks with me. Not because it reinvented cinema in some grand, flashy way, but because it respected the craft. It trusted the audience to notice the small things, to feel the difference between a quick cut and a lingering shot, between a swelling score and the sound of nothing at all. And in that trust, it created something rare, a film that doesn't just tell a story, but builds an experience around you, brick by brick, frame by frame. I remember the first time I sat down to watch the completed film, knowing who was in it, knowing their reputations, and still being floored by how different they felt here. It wasn't just performance, it was transformation. You could sense that each of them had lived with these characters for months, maybe even years, before stepping in front of the lens. They weren't playing roles. They were carrying pieces of people they had built in quiet, invisible hours no one ever sees. Let's start with the lead. In interviews, they described the preparation process with the kind of quiet intensity that makes you realize this was a job. It was a commitment. They had a notebook filled with handwritten observations, tiny sketches, even snippets of overheard conversations they thought their character might say. They'd been journaling in character every night for weeks. When I first heard that, I thought, of course, that's why it feels so real. The emotional beats don't seem rehearsed because they've been lived. Then there's a supporting cast, often the unsung heroes of any story. One of them mentioned during the press junket that they approached their role not as a secondary character, but as a protagonist of their own story that just happened to overlap with the main plot. You can see that thinking in every small choice, the way they watch the others in the scene, the pauses before speaking, the unspoken history in their eyes. It's the kind of acting that doesn't scream for attention, but deepens the entire world. The ensemble's chemistry didn't happen by accident. The director insisted on several weeks of informal rehearsals, not just script readings, but cooking meals together, walking through locations, improvising scenes that never appear in the film. One of the cast members laughed in an interview about a completely improvised family dinner they had one night, in character, just to explore dynamics. Apparently, Half the arguments in the film's big confrontation scene were inspired by things that came out during that dinner. What struck me in every interview was how openly the actors credited each other. No one seemed interested in claiming the spotlight. One of them even said, "My best scenes aren't mine. They're the ones where I'm reacting to someone else killing it." That humility shows on screen. There's no sense of competition, only collaboration. You feel like you're watching a group of people utterly invested in telling this story together. And then there's the director's role in all this. Multiple cast members describe him not as a commander, but as a gardener. They created the right environment, planted the seeds, and let the performances grow naturally. That meant fewer rigid directions and more gentle nudges. Questions like, what's the smallest choice your character could make here that would still change everything? It's a question that haunted several performances in the best possible way. From a crew's side, the cinematographer mentioned something I loved. They adjusted their shot plans after watching early rehearsals. Instead of forcing actors to fit into predetermined camera setups, they let the blocking flow for the actors' instincts, then built the visual language around that. It's why so many shots feel alive, because they're following movement born in the moment, not imposed from above. When the film finally reached audiences, the reactions mirrored the collaborative spirit behind it. The first wave of reviews from critics was glowing, yes, but what stood out to me were the audience reactions, the ones that poured into social media late at night after people came home from a theater. Some viewers talk about scenes that hit them unexpectedly hard. Not the big, obvious emotional beats, but the quieter ones. A single glance exchanged between two characters in a crowded room. A line spoken so softly you almost missed it. One person wrote that they'd been thinking about a specific 5-second shot for days and couldn't explain why. That's the power of nuance. It stays with you long after you've forgotten plot mechanics. Others connected to the humor. One audience member said they hadn't laughed that hard in years, not because of slapstick or punchlines, but because the comedy grew naturally out of character. There's a particular moment, barely a few lines long, that people started quoting online almost immediately. It wasn't even a joke in the traditional sense, but became a fan favorite because it felt so authentic to the person saying it. And of course, there are debates. This is the kind of film that doesn't just get watched. It gets discussed. People argued over character motivations, over whether certain decisions were selfish or brave, over what the final moments really meant. I love that. A film that sparks disagreement is a film that made people care. During one press panel, a cast member said they'd been following these online conversations and were thrilled by how many interpretations people had. If they all agreed, they said, "We probably did something wrong. Life's messy. Stories should be too." That struck me as the perfect encapsulation of why this particular cast worked so well. They weren't afraid of ambiguity. They trusted the audience to wrestle with it. One behind-the-scenes moment that didn't make it into the official marketing, but came up in interviews, is now my personal favorite. There's a scene late in the film where two characters share an unspoken moment of understanding. What you don't see is that in the take they used, one actor had just completely blanked on their line. Instead of stopping, they stayed in character, searching for words, and the other actor reached out, touched their arm, and filled the silence. The director loved the honesty of it and kept it. That tiny slip gave the scene a vulnerability you can feel. The premiere night was another chapter in this story. Red carpets are usually all about spectacle, but here, there was this air of genuine celebration. Like a theater troupe stepping out after closing night. The cast hugged each other constantly, and you could see the months of shared work etched in their faces. During the Q&A afterward, they kept turning the mic toward one another, making sure everyone got to speak. When box office numbers started trickling in, it became clear this wasn't just a critical darling. It was connected with regular moviegoers, too. Some theaters reported repeat customers coming back within days. You'd hear stories of friends dragging reluctant companions along, saying, "You have to see this with me." That's always the truest marketing there is. And the reviews, both professional and casual, kept circling back to the same point. These performances didn't feel like performances. They felt like windows into real people's lives. That are rare magic. And it doesn't happen unless the cast, crew, and director are completely in sync. By the time the awards chatter started, no one was surprised. Even the actors who aren't usually on shortlists found their names popping up in conversations. But my favorite part of those months wasn't the trophies. It was seeing the camaraderie never fade. Interviews stayed warm. Even after the 15th time someone asked the same question, they kept telling stories about each other, about moments on set when someone went out of their way to make the day easier. It's tempting to think of filmmaking as a series of individual contributions stitched together. But here, you could see it was something else entirely, a living, breathing collaboration where everyone's fingerprints are on everything. From the way a glance is held half a second longer than expected, to the way an audience member catches their breath during a quiet scene, to the late-night arguments online about what a single decision meant. This film is the sum of all those parts. And, in the end, that's what sticks with me. Not just the story they told on screen, but the story of how they told it together. A cast that trusted each other. A crew that built the space for them to play. An audience that saw themselves in it. That's the kind of alchemy you can't fake. And it's why, long after the credits rolled, people are still talking about it. Not just because it was good, but because it felt real. I keep thinking back to the moment we started this conversation. You, me, and the promise of exploring a story in a way that wasn't rushed or reduced to quick sound bites. We've walked through so many layers since then, starting with a gentle invitation into the world of film, then peeling back the curtain to see how it works from inside. Along the way, we've wandered through its plot, meeting characters who feel more like neighbors than fictional inventions. We've explored the strange little truths of its production, the personal touches that made it breathe, and the critical perspectives that shaped its reception. What we've been doing here is not just recounting what happens. We've been excavating, digging beneath the surface of events to find the roots that feed them. That's why we talk about themes and symbolism not as abstract ideas, but as living forces. Things that move the characters, things that move us. We explored filmmaking techniques not as cold technical choices, but as brushstrokes in a painting, each one altering the light, the depth, the tone. We lingered in the settings and locations not just because they were pretty or atmospheric, but because they shaped the way the story feels in the gut. We also spent time with the cast, not as distant, polished faces from a press junket, but as people who laughed together between takes, who wrestled with creative choices, who sometimes got it wrong and found something better because of it. We remembered moments from interviews, little candid confessions that told us more than a PR-approved answer ever could. And we walked in the footprints of the audience, hearing their laughter, feeling their gasps, and reading their late-night social media posts where they tried to explain why they couldn't stop thinking about one small scene or one carefully chosen line. We recognized that the story's life didn't end in the edit suite. It kept growing out here, in the minds of people who carried it home. I think about that a lot. The way art changes once it's released into the world. Inside the bubble of production, it's a secret between the people making it. But once the lights come up in the theater, it belongs to everyone. It gets rewritten in the private experiences of each viewer. That's where the beauty lives. Not in the perfect adherence to a script or in flawless execution, but in the way a scene can mean something entirely different to you than it does to me. And yet both of us are right. So, what did we really find in this film? We found a story that refuses to stay flat. We found characters who seem to follow you out of the cinema, lingering in your peripheral vision for days. We found an artistic team unafraid to take risks, to let the messiness of human behavior guide them instead of sanding down the edges for comfort. And in the process, we found a reminder that good filmmaking isn't about being clever for its own sake. It's about connection, about honesty, about trust. This is why I love doing these deep dives with you, because we're not just reviewing a film. We're building a conversation around it, one that's as much about us as it is about the thing we're watching. You bring your own references, your own tastes, your own questions, and I bring mine. Together, we create a kind of shared authorship over the meaning. That's why I try to approach these not as verdicts, but as invitations to think, to feel, to look again. And I hope that's what you take from this journey. Not just the plot points or the technical feats, but the experience of thinking about them with care. It's easy to rush from one movie to the next in a world that feeds us a constant stream of content. It's harder and infinitely more rewarding to slow down, to sit with one story long enough to see the threads that tie it together. As we close this particular chapter, I want to leave you with a small, personal truth. Every time I finish one of these analyses, I end up seeing the film differently than I did when I started. By breaking apart, I inevitably put it back together in a way I didn't expect. It's like hearing a song you've loved for years on a new kind of speaker. You suddenly catch details you never noticed before. And it makes me appreciate not only the art itself, but the act of looking closely. That's what I want for you, too. The next time you watch something, whether the grand cinematic epic or a small indie gem, I hope you let yourself notice the little things. The way the camera lingers half a second longer than you expect. The way a prop in the background might tell you more than a line of dialogue. The way silence, when used well, can be louder than any explosion. If you found something valuable in this conversation, something that made you think or made you feel a bit more connected to the art form we both love, then I'd like to invite you to stay with me for the next one. Subscribe to Cinema Vault, not because algorithms demand it, but because you want to keep exploring like this, slowly, deeply, thoughtfully. If you click that button and ring the bell, it just means we'll keep meeting like this, to pull apart the threads of cinema and see what they're really made of. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway of all, that films, like people, reveal themselves gradually. That no matter how many reviews you read or how many behind-the-scenes stories you hear, there's always something left to discover if you're willing to look closer. We've covered a lot of ground in this discussion. We've talked about artistry and collaboration, about audience reactions and critical responses, about the unpredictable alchemy that happens when all these elements meet. We've traced the arc of the story without reducing it to a formula. We've recognized its flaws without denying its strengths. And we've given ourselves permission to just feel something about it, without worrying whether that feeling matches anyone else's. So let's hold on to that as we step away from this particular film. Let's remember that part of loving cinema is letting it change you in small ways, whether that is a shift in perspective, a burst of empathy, or simply the joy of having seen something beautiful. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Truly, these conversations only matter because you're here to share them, and I can't wait to see where we go next.